of his own being must first crush and crucify his own lower nature and inclinations. He must perforce tread what elsewhere is described as the way of the cross, and that cross is indicated by the conjunction of those working tools, which when united form a cross, and that way is involved in the scrupulous performance of all that we know those working tools signify. By perfecting his conduct, by struggles against his own natural propensities, the candidate is working the rough ashlar of his own nature into the perfect cube, and I would ask you to observe also that the cube itself contains a secret, for unfolded, it itself denotes and takes the form of the cross. The inward development which the second degree symbolizes is typified by the lowering of the triangular flap of the apron upon the rectangular portion below. This is equivalent to the rite of confirmation in the Christian churches. It denotes the progress we have made in the science, or in other words it indicates that the higher nature of the man, symbolized by the Trinity of Spirit, has descended into and is now permeating his lower nature. Hitherto, in his state of ignorance and moral blindness, the spiritual part of his nature has, as it were, but hovered above him. He has been unconscious of its presence in his constitution, but now, having realized its existence, the dayspring from on high has visited him, and the nobler part of him descends into his lower nature, illuminating and enriching it. Now the man who so develops himself, speedily becomes more conscious of the difficulties of his task, more sensitive to the obstacles the life of the outer world places in the way of the spiritual life. But he is taught to persist with fortitude and with prudence, to develop the highest within him with fervency and zeal. Upon self-scrutiny, too, that is, upon entering into that porchway of contemplation which like a winding staircase leads inward to the Holy of Holies within himself, he realizes that difficulties and obstacles placed in his way are utilized by the eternal wisdom as the necessary means of developing the latent and potential good in him, and that as the rough ashlar can only be squared and perfected by chipping and polishing, so he also can be made perfect only by toil and by suffering. He sees that difficulty, adversity and persecution serve a beneficent purpose. These are his wages, and he learns to accept them without scruple and without diffidence, knowing that he is justly entitled to them, and from the confidence he has in the integrity of that employer who has sent him into this far-off world to prepare the materials for building the temple of the heavenly city. And so, as the sign peculiar to the degree suggests, he endeavors to examine and lay bare his heart, to cast away all impurity from it, and he stands, like Joshua, praying that the light of day may be extended to him until he has accomplished the overthrow of his own inward enemies and of every obstacle to his complete development. The aspirant who attains proficiency in the work of self-perfecting to which the FC grade alludes, has passed away from the N side of the lodge, the side of darkness and imperfection, and now stands on the SC side in the meridian sunlight of moral illumination, so far as the natural man may possess it, but yet still far removed from that fuller realization of himself and of the mysteries of his own nature which it is possible for the spiritual adept or master mason to attain. Before that attainment is reached there remains for him that last and greatest trial by which alone he can enter into the great consolations and make acquaintance with the supreme realities of existence. In the places where the great mysteries have always been taught, what is ceremonially performed in our third degree is no mere symbolical representation as with us, but an actual, vital experience of a most severe character, one the nature of which can hardly be made intelligible, or even credible, to those unfamiliar with the subject. I refrain, therefore, from more than mere mention of it, observing only that it is one not involving physical death, and in this respect only is our ceremony in accord with the experience symbolized. For if you follow closely the raising ceremony, although distinct reference to the death of the body is made, yet such death is obviously intended to be merely symbolical of another kind of death, since the candidate is eventually restored to his former worldly circumstances and material comforts, and his earthly Masonic career is not represented as coming to a close at this stage. All that has happened in the third degree is that he has symbolically passed through a great and striking change, a rebirth, or regeneration of his whole nature. He has been saw in a corruptible body, and in virtue of the self-discipline and self-development he has undergone, there has been raised in him an incorruptible body, and death has been swallowed up in the victory he has attained over himself. I sometimes fear that the too conspicuous display of the emblems and trappings of mortality in our lodges is apt to create the false impression that the death to which the third degree alludes is the mere physical change that awaits all men. But a far deeper meaning is intended. The Mason who knows his science knows that the death of the body is only a natural transition of which he need have no dread whatever. He knows also that when the due time for it arrives, that transition will be a welcome respite from the bondage of this world, from his prison-like husk of mortality, and from the daily burdens incident to existence in this lower plane of life. All that he fears is that when the time comes, he may not be free from those stains of a falsehood and dishonor, those imperfections of his own nature, that may delay his after progress. No. The death to which Masonry alludes, using the analogy of bodily death and under the veil of a reference to it, is that death in life to a man's own lower self which St. Paul referred to when he protested I die daily. It is over the grave, not of one's dead body but of one's lower self, that the aspirant must walk before attaining to the heights. What is meant is that complete self-sacrifice and self-crucifixion which, as all religions teach, are essential before the soul can be raised in glory from a figurative death to a reunion with the companions of its former toils both here and in the unseen world. The perfect cube must pass through the metamorphosis of the cross. The soul must voluntarily and consciously pass through a state of utter helplessness from which no earthly hand can rescue it, and in trying to raise him from which the grip of any succoring human hand will prove but a slip, until at length divine help itself descends from the throne above and, with the lion's grip of almighty power, raises the faithful and regenerated soul to union with itself in an embrace of reconciliation and at one-ment. In all the schools of the mysteries, as well as in all the great religions of the world, the attainment of the spiritual goal just described is enacted or taught under the veil of a tragic episode analogous to that of our third degree, and in each there is a master whose death the aspirant is instructed he must imitate in his own person. In Masonry that prototype is RFRr6FPodqBe, but it must be made clear that there is no historical basis whatever for the legendary account of Hiram's death. The entire story is symbolical and was purposely invented for the symbolical purposes of our teaching. If you examine it closely you will perceive how obvious the correspondence is between this story and the story of the death of the Christian master related in the Gospels, and it is needless to say that the Mason who realizes the meaning of the latter will comprehend the former and the veiled allusion that is implied. In the one case the master is crucified between the two thieves, in the other he is done to death between two villains. In the one case appear the penitent and the impenitent thief, in the other we have the conspirators who make a voluntary confession of their guilt and are pardoned, and the others who were found guilty and put to death, whilst the moral and spiritual lessons deducible from the stories correspond. As every Christian is taught that in his own life he must imitate the life and death of Christ, so every Mason is made to represent one of the brightest characters recorded in our annals, but as the annals of Masonry are contained in the volume of the Sacred Law and not elsewhere, it is easy to see who the character is who is alluded to. As that great authority and initiate of the mysteries, St. Paul, taught, we can only attain to the Master's resurrection by being made conformable unto his death, and we must die with him if we are to be raised like him. And it is in virtue of that conformity, in virtue of being individually made to imitate the Grand Master in his death, that we are made worthy of certain points of fellowship with him, for the 5 points of fellowship of the third degree are the 5 wounds of Christ. The 3 years' ministry of the Christian Master ended with his death, and these refer to the 3 degrees of the craft which also end in the mystical death of the Masonic candidate and his subsequent raising or resurrection. The name RFRr6FPodqBe signifies in Hebrew the teacher, guru, or enlightened one, from the Father, a fact which may help you still further to recognize the concealed purpose of the teaching. Under the name of Hiram, then, and beneath a veil of allegory, we see an allusion to another master, and it is this master, this elder brother who is alluded to in our lectures, whose character we preserve, whether absent or present. that is, whether he is present to our minds or no, and in regard to whom we adopt the excellent principle, silence, lest at any time there should be among us trained in some other than the Christian faith, and to whom on that account the mention of the Christian master's name might possibly prove an offense or provoke contention. To typify the advance by the candidate at this stage of his development, the apron here assumes greater elaborateness. It is garnished with a light blue border and rosettes, indicating that a higher than the natural light now permeates his being and radiates from his person, and that the wilderness of the natural man is now blossoming as the rose, in the flowers and graces incident to his regenerated of nature, whilst upon either side of the apron are seen two columns of light descending from above, streaming into the depths of his whole being, and terminating in the sevenfold tassels which typify the sevenfold prismatic spectrum of the supernal light. He is now lord of himself, the true master mason, able to govern that lodge which is within himself, and as he has passed through the 3 degrees of purifying and self-perfecting, and squared, leveled, and harmonized his triple nature of body, soul and spirit, he also wears, on attaining mastership, the triple Tao, which comprises the form of a level, but is also the Hebrew form of the cross, the 3 crosses upon the apron thus corresponding with the 3 crosses of Calvary. To sum up the import of the teaching of the 3 degrees, it is clear, therefore, that from grade to grade the candidate is being led from an old to an entirely new quality of life. He begins his Masonic career as the natural man, he ends it by becoming through its discipline, a regenerated perfected man. To attain this transmutation, this metamorphosis of himself, he is taught first to purify and subdue his sensual nature, then to purify and develop his mental nature, and finally, by utter surrender of his old life and losing his soul to save it, he rises from the dead a master, a just man made perfect, with larger consciousness and faculties, an efficient instrument for use by the great architect in his plan of rebuilding the temple of fallen humanity, and capable of initiating and advancing other men to a participation in the same great work. This the evolution of man into Superman was always the purpose of the ancient mysteries, and the real purpose of modern Masonry is, not the social and charitable purposes to which so much attention is paid, but the expediting of the spiritual evolution of those who aspire to perfect their own nature and transform it into a more godlike quality. And this is a definite science, a royal art, which it is possible for each of us to put into practice, whilst to join the craft for any other purpose than to study and pursue the sciences to misunderstand its meaning. Hence it is that no one should apply to enter Masonry unless from the deepest promptings of his own heart, as it hungers for light upon the problem of its own nature. We are all imperfect beings, conscious of something lacking to us that would make us what, in our best moments, we fain would be. What is that which is lacking to us? What is that which is lost? And the answer is the genuine secrets of a master mason, the true knowledge of ourselves, the conscious realization of our divine potentialities. The very essence of the Masonic doctrine is that all men in this world are in search of something in their own nature which they have lost, but that with proper instruction and by their own patience and industry they may hope to find. Its philosophy implies that this temporal world is the antipodes of another and more real world from which we originally came and to which we may accelerate our return by such a course of self-knowledge and self-discipline as our teaching inculcates. It implies that this present world is the place where the symbolic stones and timber are being prepared so far off from that mystical Jerusalem where one day they will be found put together and, collectively, to constitute that temple which even now is being built without hands and without the noise or help of metal tools. And this world, therefore, being but a transient temporary one for us, it is necessarily one of shadows, images and merely substituted secrets, until such time as being raised not merely symbolically but actually, in character and knowledge and consciousness, to the sublime degree of Master Mason, we fit ourselves to learn something of the genuine secrets, something of the living realities, that lurk and live in concealment behind the outward show of things. All human life, having originated in the mystical East and journeyed into this world which, with us, is the West, must return again to its source. To quote again the verse of the brother I have already cited: From east to west the soul her journey takes.